This is episode 37, a listener's Q&A around deficits, gaining weight, and tips for night shift workers. How are we keeping, guys? Big welcome back to the Doc Fitness Podcast, and today marks the first episode of 2020, and you probably noticed the intro was slightly different or maybe updated because I'm recording this on a new microphone, and it's kind of giving me the kick I need to get these episodes flowing, because one of my big targets for this year really is doing less but doing more of the stuff that moves Doc Fitness forward and that I enjoy if I can do it as well. Like, if I could record podcasts every day of the week, I would. It's just the schedule just does not allow it. But today is a listeners Q&A style episode where we're diving into 3 questions from listeners when I pull these up on my phone from Instagram. The first one is from our online client Alan, who asks, what is the maximum deficit you would recommend to set without losing hard-earned muscle? That's question 1, so it's around fat loss and calorie deficits. And number 2 is, I don't know her name first time here because I just have the responses screenshotted, but her username is fit_fitsy87, and she asks tips for people who work shifts, nurses and the likes who don't have a normal hours work week. I presume she's asking this from a fat loss perspective, and that's the approach I'm going to take with this question. And the last one then is from a Fergal Fleming, Fergal_Fleming on Instagram. And Fergal asks, what is the best way to gain weight? So fairly super easy, straightforward question. But guys, we're going to start back at question number 1 from Alan, and that was, what is the maximum deficit you'd recommend to set when it comes to fat loss without losing hard-earned muscle? So before we start, it's a coffee sip. So, when it comes to setting a calorie deficit, this is something that we do individually for all our clients based on their current body fat levels, based on previous dieting history, based on what their current goal is. You know, if they have a prolonged fat loss phase that's going to last, we'll say, plus 8 weeks, do they want to do a shorter fat loss phase, but they don't want to spend as long losing fat, so they're willing to go a little bit more aggressive, so like 3 to 6 weeks, we'll say. And what kind of body fat levels they have, I think I've already mentioned that. What kind of activity levels they have, what kind of schedule do they have currently, what kind of training volume are they getting in. These are all going to affect the amount of calories that someone is going to be consuming across the day, which thus in turn will affect the size of the deficit that we set. For example, if I go off and I set a calorie deficit of 20% calorie deficit for myself, what that means for me versus someone who's a similar build and height to me might be drastically different based on our current activity levels across the week. Like, if I'm doing 3 gym sessions and 3 hurling pitch sessions and on my feet pretty much every single day, hitting 15 to 20,000 steps, for example, I'm going to be burning way more energy compared to somebody who's a similar height and build, but maybe they're only training 3 times a week in the gym and they have an office job. So there's massive differences in energy there in terms of one burning more than the other. So there are deficits that you're going to set. So like a 20% deficit is going to be different because number 1, the first person requires more calories anyway compared to number 2. So the calorie figures are going to be different. Like, you know, it's common sense really when you think about it. Like, if I require 3,000 calories just to sustain my energy, and somebody else, let's just say David number 2 requires only 2,500 because he's not as active, those calorie deficits are going to look drastically different. So that's step number 1. Like, it's very easy for me to blab on about this in a podcast, but this is something really that we only get into with clients because like the way fucking Instagram influencers are going these days is they'll say, oh, go onto my website and type your height, weight and age into this calorie calculator and it's going to spit you back out calories. But, you know, it's giving you a calorie number, it's probably putting you in a large deficit, which is all well and good, and if you follow it and you stick to it, you will lose fat. But where's the education around that? Where is the, like, how long do I do this for? Is this the right place to be starting for me? Etc, etc, etc. It's why people fall off the wagon, and it's why we see clients come to us. Especially, I see this trend more through my online clients, is that they've tried a similar pattern before. Or maybe they've got calorie targets off of a previous trainer, but they've never really given them any education as to why they're doing those certain calorie targets, and there was never really an endpoint to those calorie targets. They just told them to start tracking at that, and kind of that was the amount of coaching that was involved. There was nothing else added to that. versus going on and working it out yourself online. You know, I'm not saying you can't do this. I'm just saying for 99% of the people that we see, this is why we do this for them. So there's a peace of mind behind it. They know that they're doing it right and they're doing it more customized to them. So hopefully that's got that out of the way first. So let's just talk about the deficit briefly again, guys. So again, all we're talking about here is calorie deficit, creating that negative energy balance to drop body fat. Because if we're not in a deficit, we're not going to lose body fat in the first place. Now, the size of the deficit you create is going to depend on how much fat is lost. So if we look at this in simple terms, like 3,500 calories, for example, equates to 1 pound of fat. So we know that if we take out 3,500 calories out of our week, we're going to lose a pound of fat at the end of that week. If you take out double that, if you take out 7,000 calories out of your week, you should be losing 2+ pounds. But again, this is an individual thing. You might be somebody who only has a tiny bit of body fat to lose. You might even be somebody who thinks that, I don't want to lose weight, I just want to tone up. That basically means that you're already lean and all you want to do is get a little bit leaner. That's what toning up means. It means dropping body fat and showing the kind of muscle that you built underneath, right? Now I'm going to try my best not to go off topic here too much. But there's a difference between someone aiming for a pound a week that's already lean versus somebody who has carrying a bit more body fat. Like that pound a week that somebody's already really lean might be absolutely massive for them. Versus somebody who's not that lean or is carrying a bit more body fat, a pound a week would be easy to achieve. So this is why it's better to base things off percentages of body weight. So if somebody is doing a hard, aggressive calorie deficit, and when I say aggressive, I probably mean 20% plus, right? If you're going in a 20% plus deficit, you should really be aiming for between 1 to 2% of body weight drop per week. That's a rough accurate measure to go by. If you're going for like a slighter deficit, so we'll say 10 to 15%, maybe even up to 20% eventually, but let's say you're starting at the lower end, you're looking at a 0.5 to 1% body weight drop per week. And, you know, through all the research that's out there and through all the kind of anecdotal research that's been done on this as well, this seems to be the sweet spot for what's actually sustainable. But again, Alan's asking, what is the maximum deficit I'd recommend to lose body fat without losing hard-earned muscle? And funny, I think the reason he asked this actually is because we're actually doing an in-house fat loss challenge at the moment with our clients. And this is basically a 6-week aggressive fat loss phase. And the whole goal of this phase is to drop as much fat as possible without losing any muscle tissue or prolonging it past 6 weeks, because it is an aggressive phase. If we start to go past 6 weeks, we're going to risk muscle mass being lost. We're going to risk big energy dips, motivation slump, etc., etc. That's why usually when I say mini cut or aggressive fat loss phase, it just means that we're doing this for 4 to 6 weeks. It's also a lovely way for our clients to break up longer term fat loss phases. So for example, this does not mean that at the end of a 6-week fat loss phase that you're going to be in the feckin' shape of your life or the way you want to be. You might need to do 10 more of those feckin' fat loss phases, but the goal with this, or the kind of sweet spot with this, is that 6 weeks is a lot shorter than 12. It's half the feckin' time that's involved. And when clients know that and are aware that they can actually break this up into phases and get the same results, it's powerful for them. Because what we'll do is we'll do a 4 to 6 week phase. We'll take 1 to 2 week break. We'll go again. 4 to 6 week phase, 1 to 2 week break, rinse and repeat. And that's the beauty of this. Like, you can basically break up a long-term daunting fat loss phase into short little phases if you want. But the problem is, it can be severe enough to do that amongst a regular life, and we're trying to juggle a stressful job, long hours, kids, lack of sleep. You know, there's a multitude of factors that might play at this, and usually, unless you have things dialed in or you don't have too much going on right now, maybe a short-term aggressive fat loss phase might work for you. On the flip side of that, maybe a short-term aggressive fat loss phase might work for somebody who is busy because they just want to get in, get out, get it done, and get super focused, not have to think too much about their food and just hit numbers for the 6 weeks. It's funny because there's two different ways you can look at it. Sometimes it doesn't suit either of those clients. Sometimes it suits both. It's one of those things in the fitness game that it's an individual thing that you really have to work with the individual on that. But, Alan, to answer your question directly after 10 minutes of waffling on about it, the maximum that we usually look at for this kind of phase, a 4 to 6 week fat loss phase, is 25% as a starting point of a deficit. but that can be tailored up to 30% as well. Again, this depends on the client. For someone like me, that's over 200 pounds at the moment, if I went on a 25% deficit, it probably wouldn't be all that difficult for me to hit, or even a 30% deficit, because my calorie needs are already feckin' super high, versus somebody who's already very lean. Maybe they're only 140 pounds or 130 pound female, and they're looking to tone up a little bit over the next 4 to 6 weeks. And by tone up, I just mean drop body fat. If they go in a 30% deficit, their calories are going to be so feckin' low, it's going to be miserable. So for them, we will set things a little bit less aggressively, a little less daunting. And if we did go up to that like 30% deficit, even beyond that, it would only be a very short-term thing, like 2 to 3 week kind of phase, which we've done that with clients before. It depends time of year, like people when they're getting close to weddings, if they're getting close to holidays, we can manipulate this stuff to kind of get the most out of it. But to be honest, I think a lot of that goes over the scope of what this podcast is going to go through today, because this is an advanced topic really we're talking about. So 25-30%, Alan, is usually the sweet spot, but again, I would not put these phases past 4 to 6 weeks, because you start to notice negative effects beyond that. And this is assuming as well that you're hitting that deficit every single week, and you've other things dialed in, like your sleep, protein intake, training, etc. Like, are you able to recover at the end of each week and hit the next week hard without being too fucking bed up or tired? And you're finding the 6 weeks relatively handy-ish. Like, there should be a bit of struggle there because it is an aggressive phase, but usually if you've things dialed in, we get through the 4 to 6 weeks fairly easily and fairly okay. So yeah, that's in terms of maximum deficits that you can set when it comes to fat loss. And if you haven't noticed already, like, the cool thing about this is once you've kind of cracked the code behind some basic fat loss fundamentals, you have the ability to manipulate this stuff and to dive into realms you probably never thought possible when it comes to kind of fat loss and dieting, because everyone in dieting talks about dropping body fat and fat loss this and fat loss that and calorie deficit this and protein that. But they never fucking talk about taking an actual break. They never talk about to make it realistic for your actual lifestyle. And that's stuff that we're massive on here, and that's why we educate clients over time on this more detailed stuff. Okay. Moving on. Number 2. So, what do I recommend for shift workers? Coffee sip number 2. This is a funny one because this one crops up every now and then, in that, do you ever hear that myth around eating late is bad for you, eating late causes you to gain fat, eating late is bad for your metabolism? And I always say, if eating late or eating after 6 p.m. is that old myth that you will believe, people still believe that shit. That's the crazy thing. People still believe this. And I'd be just left absolutely dumbfounded when I hear this stuff. I'm like, you do realise that's like one of the biggest myths or oldest myths going. But again, that's just because I'm involved in this stuff daily, and 99% of our clients are not. So I can see how it's easy to fall into the trap of believing things and believing myths. It depends on who you're followed to and who you're influenced by. But if you're a night shift worker, if that myth was actually true, if eating late was quote unquote bad or made you fat, night shift workers would be probably all overweight. But we know that's not the case. On the flip side of that, you might know somebody who has moved to night shifts and they have gained a lot of weight. You might also know somebody on the other side that have moved to night shifts and have lost a lot of weight. I usually see people lose weight more than gain it, simply because the routine is so out of whack. They don't want to be eating at 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, where they would normally be having, like a heavy lunch meal, for example, if it was a normal day. They end up kind of picking throughout a night shift and drinking like fucking cups of coffee, Red Bull and cups of tea, but they don't eat that much calories. As a result, they lose weight. Now, is it healthy? Usually diets kind of go all over the shop when night shift workers start first, which is okay because it's a big transition for people. People don't think about this stuff. They just go about their night shift and they realise, oh fuck, my nutrition is all over the place. Some people don't even think about that until 3 years later. So you have to take this with a pinch of salt as well. It's not to say that you should know how to approach your nutrition the second you are put on night shifts if you start doing them, because no one does. First tip I would give for it is, depends on how your week is. If you have if you have 3 to 5 night shifts a week and you're trying to reset things to normal on the weekend, like, it is hard to do. In an ideal world, you would probably keep your same sleep and wake pattern throughout the week the same, and you're just trying to adapt to that, rather than trying to reset every weekend and go back into your night shift again. The easiest way to look at this, it's kind of like you're flying into a different flight zone every week. If you're spending 2/3 of the week or 3/4 of the week waking and sleeping at a certain time, and then you're trying to reset that to go to quote unquote normal hours on a weekend, it's like you're getting mini jet lag. The ways you can counteract that is by using melatonin. So actually in Ireland you can't just go in and buy melatonin over the counter, by the way, and I'm not prescribing it on this podcast. I'm just saying maybe it's something you can ask your GP about. But basically melatonin is a natural hormone that's secreted when we're trying to doze off to sleep. And the easiest way to think of this is it's kind of like the shotgun at the start of a race. It's like the signal for you to sleep. So just like the signal at the start of a race is like the bang to sprint, the melatonin is a signal that's released to bring on normal sleeping patterns. So when you're in a night shift work, let's say it's your first night on a night shift, and it's like 11 or 12 o'clock, and you're a couple of hours in, and all of a sudden you start to feel very sleepy and droopy. That's because the melatonin is naturally being released anyway. And then you kind of pick up after that. Maybe you get some caffeine in you to offset that, and eventually when you get home you find it very, very hard to fall back to sleep, because now it's the morning time where you would naturally be getting up, where your body naturally secretes cortisol to help you deal with that day and get up and attack the day. But your things are out of whack. Your hormones are out of whack, your circadian rhythm's out of whack, your sleeping cycle's out of whack. So that can throw things out over the shop, and usually after the first week you're just left absolutely drained after it all. So that's tip number one, is can you keep a consistent-ish pattern? If not, which I know is 99.9% of the people that can't, you're resetting on the weekend, I would try and recommend to look into melatonin. So basically when you come off your first night shift, you might stay up for you might go to bed for a few hours and you come home that day, but you wake up again like midday and you stick out the rest of the day, and then that night, so let's just pretend it's a Friday night, Thursday night, you're trying to go back to like a normal sleeping pattern, you will take melatonin that night to try and help with the onset of sleep. Try and sleep as best you can, even if you wake midnight and you're wide awake, to stay in bed and try and get as much shut-eye as you can. Wake up in the morning, go about your normal day, and then maybe take melatonin that night again. I haven't seen any research to see any long-term adverse health effects when it comes to taking melatonin like that. But again, this is something that you can go through with your GP. They might look at you sideways if you tell them that you heard this on a podcast for some quote unquote fitness guy, and they might give you eyeballs. But the fact of the matter is, it depends on the GP you ask as well, because if they're open to it and open-minded and have looked at the research behind it and understand it all, which they should, they'll be able to give you a much better educated opinion on it. That's number one. Number two, like when you're coming home from night shifts, right, and you're winding down trying to go to sleep, everything is so bright around you. You're met by daylight, you're met by bright lights, and wherever you work, getting home until lights on in the house, etc., etc. Like the second you leave work, you should be trying to wind down, because you do want to go home and just get into bed straight away if you can, if you don't have to go bringing kids to school or anything like that. So you can buy what's called blue blocking glasses, and all this does is that it's blocking kind of the blue light coming in. And when I say blue light, I just mean like either natural light or light from like computers, phone screens, or lights in a house. And by doing that, you're giving your body the best chance to try and transition into that sleep mode to get some nice sleep that night. That, coupled with a bit of melatonin, can help with that. But again, it's just kind of winding down habits going to bed. In an ideal world, people might adopt using blue blocking glasses late at night anyway, even if they're up later on their phone or their laptops or like that, to help wind down going to bed. And there is some research behind it, which is cool, because I know I've been using these myself for a few years, but there hasn't been any actual research behind it. And the way those glasses are now, you can actually get like, normal looking glasses that just look like glasses. They don't have to be big, feckin' ugly orange yolks, which is what they used to be. You can get normal looking glasses that no one will know any difference even if you had them on the last hour of work, the last half an hour of work before you go home, or just throw them on before you get in your car, for example. That's just going to help with the onset of sleep. So there are kind of two things you can do straight off the bat. Like you can't ignore the basics of getting enough rest, recovery, and sleep. The second side is probably the food side. And this is a side where, again, people don't really look into it really much until they're months deep and they realise that they don't really have an eating pattern at all. They're just kind of picking here, there and everywhere, and they're severely lacking in probably protein or eating not enough calories, or else they're doing the other side of it and they're eating very little and they're ordering pizzas in the middle of the night or Soup Max in the middle of the night, McDonald's, wherever it is, and they're overeating as kind of a routine with the staff night shift workers, which I know happens a lot too. So the easiest tip I would give for that is try to take your regular day and just apply to your night shift. So obviously you mightn't have breakfast because it's hard to kind of get up and eat something like a first meal straight off the bat if you're going to work in a couple of hours. You might prefer just to get up, maybe have a coffee and just get going, get into work in the next hour, and then you're working for a couple of hours, and then you might like to eat your first meal. If you don't, you just have a meal before you go in and you treat that like a normal breakfast. I'm not saying it has to be something cold or like that. I'm just saying it's your meal number one. I think if you stop calling them breakfast, lunch and dinner, it just takes a bit of confusion out of it for yourself, and just look at them as getting your, let's say, calorie needs in across the day. So meal one, you might have one, just a small one before you go into work, protein based, veggie based, just keep it satiating so you're a little bit full before going to work. For your meal two, again, you might like something nice and warm and kind of homely feel in the middle of a night, especially if you're in Ireland and it's fucking, it's freezing outside and you're in that, you want that kind of warmth, that hot feel like. I would have something that you could just either throw into a microwave nice and quick that kind of gives you that effect and that's easy to eat. Again, if that that wouldn't work for you, like have something that's very, very simple and maybe sweet and tasty to have. Like it could be a low fat, high protein, small little yogurt that's only 100 to 200 calories, but maybe you might put in a few berries in with that and a small bit of honey, because it's kind of easy to eat. It's a bit of a sweet feeling and it's tasty, and you're getting a little bit of protein there as well. For your next meal, again, you're just trying to repeat the same. We're trying to realistically keep the same principles as your regular day there, in that you're trying to get a protein source in, some carbohydrates, and some veggies in that meal, a little bit of fats, whatever. It kind of depends on what style of meal you cook and what kind of protein source you choose, but like the same principles are there. If you're somebody who just doesn't have a structure at all, you need to sit down with yourself and have a look at what would you like and enjoy. Have a template of, right, this meal needs to have a protein source, needs to have some sort of nutrients in there, so it needs to have some veggies, needs to have a bit of a carb source, maybe some fruit, and kind of where my fat source is coming from. That's where you should be looking for those meals anyway. And if you have 3 of those kind of big meals a night, you're getting a nice hefty protein serving them within each. You're fairly on track there as it is. Like if you're having 20 to 40 grams of protein per meal, you're laughing. Like you might have a high protein snack around that. Maybe you might have a feckin' chocolate bar, a couple of chocolate biscuits with a cup of tea or something like that throughout the night. Maybe you might have some low calorie crisps and a chocolate bar later on the night before you go home. They're perfectly fine to have, and I know those cravings are natural or night shifts anyway. It's not to say that's bad. Again, it's just making sure that if your goal is fat loss, you're still remaining in the deficit. If your goal is just maintain your weight, that you are maintaining your weight and you're getting enough protein and you feel energized for your night shift. And that's about it really. When you go back to your normal rhythm on the weekend, for example, your day is as normal. But again, usually I find people is that they just don't feel like eating breakfast when they wake up after a day off or after their night shift, and because you're kind of waking up that evening, but instead you might just have a big dinner meal, get to bed, wake up the next day and go again. And if you do that for a few weeks and you notice you're losing weight, and losing weight's not your goal, you can just look to bump up your calories in your main meals a little bit, because when you do the transition over from your night shift back into a regular day at the weekend, you can actually lose out on nearly half a day's eating during those phases. So there's something to be aware of. But hopefully that gives you some food for thought for that one. Hopefully there's some takeaways in it. Lastly is the question from Fergal. The best way to gain weight. And this one came through, all these questions came through on Instagram. And I suppose the easiest way I can give the example on best way to gain weight is the basic fundamentals. Are you in a calorie surplus above all? Because remember, this all comes back to calorie intake. Number 1, are you in a calorie surplus enough to gain weight? And number 2, are you doing sufficient training volume to elicit strength gains and actually build muscle tissue? This one from Fergal is broken down, guys, into those 2 steps. Are you in a calorie surplus? So are you eating more than you're expanding, more energy? Are you eating more calories than you're expanding? Are you eating sufficient protein? So are you getting at least, let's say, 2 grams per kilo of protein? And are you training enough throughout the week so you're actually getting stronger in the gym, and the majority of the weight gained is shuttling towards muscle tissue rather than fat mass? That is the golden circle of muscle gain, because I assume Fergal just doesn't want to gain fat. The problem is when it comes to lads and gaining weight is that they just do not do enough in the gym. Or else there's the flip side of that, and they might go into the gym 3 times a week and they're trying to go super hard on their squats and their overhead presses and their bench press, or maybe they're bench pressing every day. They just try to do too much, and they don't really progress because they're constantly tired under those main lifts. And because they're constantly tired and always pushing those sets to failure, they're not actually getting that much training volume in because they're so zonked after their first 1 to 3 sets, if that makes sense. So again, as a general rule for hypertrophy training, the amount of volume, when I say volume, it's basically the sets and reps you do for each muscle group across the week. If you're recovering from that, so like let's just say you train some squats on day 1 of the week, and maybe like another lower body quad movement in there, and then you have some hamstring movements in there. Let's just say you did 3 quad movements on a Monday. Are your quads so bet up come a Thursday, Friday that you can't really train them again because you're just still so sore? If that's the case, maybe you might take out a quad exercise of your first day and put 2 quad exercises into later on the week. Again, these kind of questions are stuff that we do individually for clients based on what they can handle, what they can recover from. And then things like those questions, Dave, is 3 days better than 4 days, is better than 5 days? Again, it depends, because it depends on number of days you have available to train. It depends on how much muscle groups you want to focus on, or which ones you want to kind of focus on more. And it depends on what you find best for you allocating across the week. So like, for example, here we focus on 3 full body workouts. So we need to be smart with our programming in that each workout is programmed smartly, so they're not being absolutely bet up after every single session and they're wrecked for the next day. It needs to be able to flow. So by the time day 3 comes, whatever they done on day 1 should be recovered enough so they can hit it again on day 3. So we're adhering to the kind of scientific principles behind muscle group training for the best gains, so to speak, but we're not beating ourselves up. So yes, I know I'm breaking this down into kind of simplest things by saying eating a calorie surplus, eating a protein, train hard enough, but that's it. Like, that is the golden circle. As I said, people don't know how to train hard enough, or they train too hard on a certain select few movements, which kind of affects up the rest of their training, or they don't know how much is too much. They don't know how many days is how many, is what's optimal for them. They don't know how much protein, or if they do, they're just kind of not consistent with that, or they're not consistent with the calorie surplus in the first place. And if you take a GAA player, for example, their energy needs are massive across the week, right? And if you're trying to throw in 2 to 3 gym workouts on top of that, and they're trying to gain weight, it's probably best to do this in your pre-season. Even at that, it's hard because you're expanding so much energy. But somebody who is like 6 foot plus might require over 4,000 calories a day just to start gaining a couple of pounds a month. And that's a lot of calories, like. And if you're not used to that, which I know a lot of GA players aren't, it's very hard to do. Where do you start with a surplus? Like, an easy way for somebody who's never tracked a calorie before or knows what the hell I was ambling around with the deficits or like that, or what I mean by a surplus, it's like if you whipped out My Fitness Pal and you tracked your calorie intake for a couple of weeks, right? And you did your training as normal and you tracked it for a couple of weeks, and you realize, okay, I'm getting in 2,500, kind of 2,700 calories roughly as a daily average. That person probably needs to add in an extra 1,000 calories into that. Let's just pretend if they were training on a pitch 3 times a week, 70 to 80 minute sessions, and they're in the gym 3 hours a week doing like performance-based pitch style sessions, or if they are not if they don't care too much with the performance side of things, they're trying to train to get bigger, build muscle, which is hypertrophy style training, bodybuilding style training. Track your intake for about 2 weeks. If your weight is kind of going down with that, you need to first see where your weight is being maintained. So you might need to increase it by a couple of 100 calories just to see, right, where is my weight going to maintain at the calorie intake that I'm on now? And then from there, I would start by adding 10% of a surplus, 10 to 15% of a surplus on top of that. So that could be anywhere from 200 to 500 calories for someone. And then we just tweak it from there. Because, again, this depends on the person, and it depends on a multitude of factors. It depends on how experienced they are with this stuff, and you don't want to throw people in the deep end with trying to eat way more food when they can barely even eat enough to sustain their energy as it is. So there's all these factors that come into play as well. But to answer it simply and to recap on that one, guys, what's the best way to gain weight? You need to be training enough so you're actually building muscle tissue. You need to be eating enough protein so the majority of the weight gain is going to muscle tissue gain. Same goes for the training. They're the two keys, but you also need to be fundamentally, you need to be in a calorie surplus. And yes, nice quick fire episode with my new mic, done under half an hour. Hopefully, guys, there were some takeaways there. I hope there is sense to that. Sometimes I just like to go off on tangents. I understand that, but you wouldn't be continuing to listen if you didn't like that. But question 1, tracking and the deficit. I said kind of 25 to 30% plus in rare cases. Depends on the person, is like the maximum deficit without losing muscle tissue, but it depends on the length of the phase, and a large part of that depends on, are you ready for an aggressive fat loss phase? Most people aren't. Number 2, there's tips for night shift workers. I talked a bit about melatonin and maybe liaising with your GP on that. I talked a bit about just having an objective look at your night to see what would you actually enjoy consuming based on kind of like a generic meal template. And then number 3, we looked at the best way to gain weight in terms of creating a surplus, but making sure that protein training targets are being hit as well. And that's all I have for today, guys. The next episode hopefully will be an interview style episode. And as always, on Instagram, please keep an eye out for when I am personally asking questions on my Instagram over at the Doc Fitness, because when I ask questions there, I literally take them, I screenshot them, and I address them on this podcast, and they will eventually get aired sometime if they are good enough or just not silly questions, because you'll be surprised the amount of times people ask me about penises and other stupid stuff, but they're mostly my friends that are just taking the piss out of me. Wherever you're listening to, if you're out for a walk, if you're in the car, have a great day, and chat to you next time. Bye bye.